Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez locked her gaze onto John Kennedy and publicly branded him a complete joke, a walking punchline, and a late-night comedian wielding a gavel. She delivered this scathing assessment on live broadcast television, ensuring her words were captured by every camera lens positioned in the hearing room before the senator had even managed to utter a single syllable. What she remained blissfully unaware of, however, was the secret tucked neatly inside his breast pocket: 3 separate index cards bearing her exact quotes, alongside the quiet, unshakable patience of a man from Zachary, Louisiana. He had spent his entire professional career waiting for someone possessing exactly this brand of supreme overconfidence to step into his arena. By the time their exchange concluded, she would find herself entirely incapable of finishing a basic sentence. Senator Kennedy has occupied a seat in this legislative body for nearly a decade, Ocasio-Cortez declared to the room. He manufactures quick one-liners, he generates catchy sound bites, and he's the specific sort of quote that performs exceptionally well on background television when produces citizens aren't paying genuine attention. She then gestured pointedly toward the far edge of the dais. What we have seated down at that end is a remarkably talented comedian equipped with a gavel. Kennedy did not so much as glance upward. He simply reached for his pen, scribbled a deliberate note on his yellow legal pad, set the pen back down onto the desk, and resumed reviewing whatever paperwork he had been focused on. The spectators filling the gallery observed this calm sequence of actions, holding their breath in anticipation of a dramatic reaction that simply never materialized. Sitting inconspicuously in the third row was a 68-year-old retired pipefitter from Sulphur, Louisiana, named Raymond Thibodeau. He had driven 4.5 hours that very morning and was now gazing at Kennedy with the specific expression of a person needing to verify if they had just heard the exact same level of disrespect. Kennedy remained fiercely focused on his legal pad. He had certainly heard every word. The scribbled note on his yellow pad was a silent anchor, something that would become immensely important before the morning proceedings concluded. If you have ever watched a person decide before a single word is even spoken that your particular region of the country is completely unserious, pay close attention, because the man just dismissed as a walking punchline was about to take control of the microphone. His initial maneuver would reveal absolutely everything about the strategy that followed. The committee chairman meticulously moved through the initial administrative agenda before nodding toward the far end of the rostrum to yield the floor to Senator Kennedy. Kennedy finally looked up, set his pen down on the desk, pulled his microphone a half-inch nearer using just 2 fingers, and flashed Ocasio-Cortez that slow, familiar Louisiana grin. It was the kind of gentle expression that suggests he just remembered something subtly amusing from 3 days prior and was still weighing whether it was worth mentioning aloud. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, turning his steady eyes toward Ocasio-Cortez. "Congresswoman, I truly appreciate your presence here today. I know it is quite a long drive down from New York." She politely replied that she was glad to be present. Good. Good. Kennedy nodded agreeably. "Now, I thoroughly reviewed your written testimony. I read every single word of it, which I want you to know is something I do not always have the time to do. So please take that as a genuine compliment." A faint, friendly ripple of laughter echoed across the spectator gallery. "I want to start our discussion with a very specific detail. You testified today that working-class families across this nation are being aggressively priced out of home ownership due to what you specifically termed the predatory concentration of rental properties inside private equity portfolios. That is your chosen phrase, correct?" "That is correct," she confirmed without hesitation. "All right, excellent. Now, you represent New York's 14th congressional district, which comprises roughly 150,000 households, correct?" "Approximately, yes," she answered. "And your proposed legislation introduces a massive federal funding framework that would, over a 10-year duration, redirect approximately $40 billion toward building affordable housing across the entire country." Kennedy looked straight into her eyes. "That is a truly massive figure. I want to ensure I fully comprehend it." As she attempted to launch into an explanation of the analysis, Kennedy casually interrupted. "I will absolutely get to the breakdown. I just want to ensure we are entirely aligned on the total figure first. $40 billion across 10 years. That is the projected cost, correct?" "Yes," she answered firmly. "All right, then here's my core question," he said, leaning slightly forward while maintaining that same unhurried, relaxed posture like a local asking for directions he already knows, just to see which way the tourist points. Out of that $40 billion, how much money goes directly to the congressional districts represented by the members who vote to fund it? And how much goes to the districts that get left holding the bill? There was a brief pause in the room. Not terribly long, but a specific type of silence that possessed a distinct shape and weight. The distribution formula written inside the bill is based strictly on socioeconomic need, Ocasio-Cortez countered defensively. It is mathematically indexed to local housing cost burdens by county. It is absolutely not a political map. I fully understand that is what the language of the formula says, Kennedy replied evenly. I want to know what the formula actually achieves in reality. Because when I took the time to examine the last 3 major federal housing programs, I researched them thoroughly and wrote the statistics down. Right here, they allocated between 62% and 71% of their massive construction funding exclusively to the 20 largest metropolitan areas. Coincidentally, those urban regions are represented almost entirely by the very legislators who drafted those bills in the first place. He let that heavy reality sit over the room. Now, I am certainly not claiming you did that intentionally. I am merely stating that it represents a clear, undeniable pattern. And I want to know if your new bill disrupts that pattern or simply perpetuates it. Because the hardworking citizens of my state who are financing this endeavor deserve to know if they are paying for homes they will ever actually be allowed to live in. The spectator gallery had grown quiet in an entirely different manner than before. It was no longer the silence of an audience passively listening to a comedian. It was the tense quiet of a room suddenly realizing that the supposed comedian had brought a calculator to the debate. Ocasio-Cortez leaned aggressively closer to her microphone. Senator, the allocation framework was explicitly designed from the ground up to address historical funding disparities in federal housing investment, including— I know exactly what it was intended to do, Kennedy interjected smoothly. I want to know what it actually does on the ground. Do you possess the county-level funding projections for Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama right now? She nervously shuffled a paper inside her folder, then moved another. I currently have the regional summary available, she said. The regional summary places Louisiana inside the South Atlantic zone, Kennedy observed sharply, which is a broad category that also encompasses Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. So when I review the South Atlantic breakdown, I cannot possibly determine how much is being directed to Baton Rouge versus how much is being swallowed up by Bethesda. He picked up his lukewarm cup of coffee, found it unappealing, and deliberately set it back down. I am going to ask my staff to formally forward your office a list of the exact metrics I am seeking. I would greatly appreciate answers before we cast our votes. He looked at her with a calm, perfectly level gaze. That is not a hostile partisan demand. That is simply what actual legislative oversight looks like when someone is finally doing it. This was the absolute core truth about John Kennedy that seasoned political observers in those hearing rooms knew to watch for. He never, ever revealed his target beforehand. He refused to telegraph his maneuvers. Those first 6 intense questions were not purely about housing policy. They were masterfully designed to establish in front of the entire chamber that he had read the legislation far more thoroughly than she ever anticipated, that he possessed hard data she lacked in front of her, and that the man she derisively labeled a comedian had completed the rigorous homework she assumed he wouldn't do. The balance of power in the room had shifted just enough. I have a few more questions, Kennedy stated calmly. And they are going to pivot to a completely different subject. He slowly reached into his breast pocket and produced 3 index cards. Folded exactly once, he placed them deliberately face down on the dais, leaving them untouched for the moment. You attended a major conference in Munich back in February, Kennedy said. Ocasio-Cortez visibly tightened her jaw slightly. I did, she replied. A massive international stage, a global audience. Kennedy continued. You traveled all the way there to make the grand case that Democrats are fully prepared to direct global foreign policy. That is a remarkably serious endeavor, and I want to give you full, unvarnished credit for that level of ambition. I stand firmly by every word I uttered there, she asserted defensively. I know you do, and I want to ask you about a very specific statement, Kennedy said, subtly tilting his head with a mild, curious expression like a man who repeatedly spots the same intriguing pebble in various rivers. When discussing the complex situation in Venezuela and the administration's policy regarding the Maduro government, you stated, and I am going to quote your exact words, "That does not mean we can simply abduct a head of state and participate in acts of war just because a nation sits below the equator." He looked directly into her eyes. "Where exactly is Venezuela located relative to the equator, ma'am?" A highly uncomfortable pause hung in the air. I was presenting a much broader argument regarding, I understand completely, and I promise I will address the broader argument shortly. Kennedy cut in with velvet smoothness. I simply want to establish the basic geography first so we are all examining the exact same map. Kennedy stared at her with that deeply patient demeanor, the kind that initially appears gentle until you suddenly realize that there's absolutely nothing soft beneath it. Is Venezuela situated above or below the equator? The expansive hearing room went dead silent. In the distinct way a space grows quiet when everyone present already knows the answer and is just waiting to see if the witness does too. I misspoke while I was in Munich, Ocasio-Cortez finally acknowledged. The core substance of the argument, you certainly did misspeak, Kennedy noted flatly. Venezuela lies distinctly north of the equator. Caracas is situated at roughly 10 degrees north latitude. That is not a minor boundary line call, that is a massive difference of a couple thousand miles. He paused for maximum effect. I looked it up this morning just to make sure I wasn't the one who was confused. That final sentence was delivered completely flat, entirely devoid of any smile. The gallery instantly exploded, not with polite giggles, but with genuine, uncontrollable laughter that burst out forcefully before people could decide whether they intended to laugh at all. A male spectator near the aisle pressed his fist hard against his lips. A seasoned reporter's shoulders shook uncontrollably. The wave of amusement spread from the very center of the room outward, taking nearly 4 full seconds to completely dissipate. In row 3, Raymond Thibodeau slowly shook his head side to side, not laughing, but shaking his head in the exact way a person does when a long-held suspicion is definitively confirmed to be true. Now, I'm certainly not going to turn a simple geography error into a major federal case, Kennedy said, raising one placating hand. Lord knows I have made statements on live camera that I desperately wish I could retract. I once boastfully told a room full of wealthy donors that I had read every word of a bill that hadn't even been printed yet. So I am certainly not the geography police. He deliberately flipped the first index card face up. However, here is the real issue. Congresswoman, you arrogantly entered this chamber this morning and informed this committee and everyone watching at home that I do not produce anything serious, that I merely generate punchlines, and that this nation has absolutely no time left for jokes. Kennedy fixed his eyes on her, unsmiling, rigid, and steady. Yet in the very same month you traveled all the way to Munich to convince the entire world that Democrats are ready to lead. You placed a sovereign nation in the completely wrong hemisphere on a global stage, with live cameras rolling. He allowed the stinging reality to resonate. Now, I want to be entirely fair. A single mistake does not constitute a pattern, but it certainly makes your bold opening declaration this morning incredibly fascinating. If you have ever been branded as the unserious individual by someone who couldn't even pass an elementary 5th grade geography quiz, leave a single word in the comments right now, just one word. Type Munich. Because what you just witnessed is only a fraction of the story. Kennedy still holds 2 more index cards in that pile, and the second one carries far greater weight than the first. Ocasio-Cortez set her jaw firmly. She was no stranger to hostile environments, rooms filled with people actively hoping she would fail before she even opened her mouth. She had built her entire political career on learning precisely how to turn the energy in such aggressive rooms. When the ground shifted perilously beneath her, she executed her standard, most reliable tactic. She completely altered the fundamental nature of the conflict. Leaning directly into her microphone, her voice returned with its familiar, commanding cadence. "Senator, I want to be entirely clear about what is actually transpiring here," she said, looking right past Kennedy and directly into the camera lens, tapping perfectly into her instinct for creating viral sound bites. "Because I strongly believe the public watching this deserves absolute clarity. A woman of color appears before this panel to testify extensively about a devastating housing crisis destroying working-class families across America. She misstates a geographical coordinate in a separate setting weeks ago during a discussion on a completely different policy topic, And the immediate response from the other end of this dais is not an inquiry about housing. It is not a question regarding the millions of citizens who cannot afford a roof over their heads. It is a petty geography quiz. Her voice fully found its rhythmic tempo. I have been fiercely engaged in this work for 6 years. I have successfully passed legislation, and I have fought relentlessly for people who could never afford a high-priced lobbyist. Yet at every single time, the standard response from the opposing side is not to engage with the substantive issues, but to aggressively hunt for a single moment, a single sentence, or a single word to weaponize and erase everything else. She pointed dramatically toward the gallery. The powerful women operating in this country recognize this tired playbook. You wait patiently for one human error, one single mistake, and then you deploy it as though it defines an entire biography, as if geography were a direct proxy for intelligence. Intelligence a proxy for human worth. And worthiness, something men exactly like you get to freely assign. This is not about Venezuela. It was never about Venezuela. This is exclusively about who is permitted to be taken seriously in this room. And I will not sit at this table and pretend otherwise. For a brief moment, give her full credit, the maneuver was incredibly effective. The energy in the room visibly shifted. Her emotion was genuine and her anger palpable. A reporter's pen moved furiously across a notepad. A young woman seated in the gallery who had been actively suppressing a grin since the geography slip now looked down at her hands, her facial expression completely altering. The deeply familiar reflex rippled through the space, the conditioned, trained instinct to shrink back from the sheer magnitude of such an accusation rather than inspect the underlying truth of it. It held the room captive for roughly 20 seconds. In row 3, Raymond Thibodeau looked closely at Kennedy. Kennedy was calmly writing on his legal pad. Keeping his eyes firmly down, he wrote a phrase, drew a deliberate, slow line beneath it, and set his pen aside. He then looked up, waiting patiently for the emotional wave to clear the room before reaching for the second index card. I appreciate that perspective, Congresswoman, Kennedy remarked, his tone completely unaltered. He maintained the exact same unhurried southern drawl and flat patience, like a man sitting comfortably on a front porch all afternoon with absolutely no intention of heading indoors anytime soon. And I promise I want to return to housing shortly. I promised the chairman I would reach that topic. He deliberately flipped the second index card face up. However, since we are speaking so candidly about Munich, I want to ask you about the other critical question they asked you that evening. Because while the geography error was a simple slip, the kind that happens to the absolute best of us, the second item is far more difficult to place in that innocent category. He carefully studied the card. Somebody directly asked you whether the United States ought to deploy military forces to defend Taiwan if China launches an invasion. That represents the single most consequential national security question in American foreign policy today. Every ally we possess and every adversary we face is closely watching how American leaders answer it. Kennedy looked up. I am going to read your exact response, not my summary, but the literal transcript. He read the words flatly, without a trace of sarcasm or emphasis. I think that this is such a, I think that this is a, this is of course a, very long-standing, policy of the United States. He laid the card down on the wood. 5 separate 20 agonizing seconds of hesitation, and then you concluded by saying you hoped we would never have to find out. The room grew profoundly still, not the laughter-filled silence of the geography moment, but something far heavier and more serious. I fully understand the instinct to be careful, Kennedy noted. Prudence is a genuine virtue in this line of work, and I would infinitely prefer a cautious leader over a reckless one any day of the week, and twice on Sundays. He folded his hands together. However, there is a fundamental distinction between being cautious and being completely empty. When the question centers on standing by an ally while foreign ministries across the globe are observing, emptiness carries a very real cost. It just isn't paid by the person holding the microphone. Down in the third row, Raymond Thibodeau sat completely motionless. He thought of his nephew, his brother Danny's son, who had completed 2 brutal military tours in the Pacific, the kind of young man who rarely discusses his service upon returning home. He was precisely the sort of person Kennedy was describing, the ones who bear the real consequences that speakers at microphones effortlessly avoid. Raymond pondered his nephew and stared down at his own worn hands. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Kennedy pressed, and I would like a simple, direct yes or no answer. We can handle the nuances afterward. He looked straight at her. Do you believe the United States should commit to defending Taiwan? Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to speak. Yes or no, ma'am. If you have ever sat in a waiting room, a kitchen, or a vehicle watching a politician in Washington completely dodge a critical question you desperately needed answered, subscribe to this channel right now. What Kennedy executed is exactly what should have been done 2 years ago, and her answer, or lack thereof, reveals the true foundation of what her opening statement was actually made of. The nuance, Ocasio-Cortez stated fiercely, is the entire point. Nuance is what separates actual foreign policy from a simplistic bumper sticker. And I refuse to reduce the lives of American service members to a binary yes or no answer that will be clipped and weaponized before nightfall. All right, Kennedy said calmly. All right. He picked up the third and final index card. Let us turn to a topic closer to home. The Fighting Oligarchy tour this past spring. You and Senator Sanders conducted 34 rallies, addressing 300,000 attendees across 20 different states. I am immensely proud of that effort, she stated. You should be. That is a massive crowd and considerable travel miles, Kennedy acknowledged, nodding with almost genuine admiration. I want to ask you about those miles. He turned the final card face up. Your official campaign finance reports reveal that in 2025, your campaign spent an astounding $53,000 on luxury 4-star and 5-star hotel accommodations, including the Langham Huntington in Pasadena, the Vdara in Las Vegas, the Asher Adams in Salt Lake City, and the Lansdowne Resort in Virginia. He looked at her. That money came directly from your small-dollar contributors, the folks donating $10 and $20. A heavy, quiet pause fell over the chamber. Now, I want to pair that detail with one additional fact so we have the complete picture before I ask my question. During that exact same tour, in the same spring, reporting indicated that you and Senator Sanders utilized private aircraft to travel to West Coast events. Ocasio-Cortez immediately began to object, but Kennedy raised a calm, patient hand. The very same week you flew private to Los Angeles, you stood on a stage declaring to the audience that the billionaire class had rigged the system against ordinary citizens, and that working people needed to rise up and fight back. He set the final card down. I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear that I mean it sincerely. Kennedy fixed his unhurried gaze upon her, the look of a man who requires absolutely nothing from the individual across the table. When you urge working people to fight, which luxury hotel are you returning to afterward? The gallery went dead silent, not laughter, but a lower, deeper sound of a room recognizing an uncomfortable truth about a person and not quite knowing what to do with it. Because here's what I have observed. Congresswoman, Kennedy's voice did not rise. It grew even quieter and more deliberate, emphasizing every single word. There are individuals in this country who put on the working class like a coat when the cameras turn on. When the lighting dims, they retreat to the Langham. He slowly shook his head in a sorrowful fashion. The people actually working, the ones who scrape together to send you $10, they notice. They always notice. They just cannot afford the luxury to say so into a microphone. In row 3, Raymond Thibodeau examined his hands, the heavily weathered hands of a man who had spent 31 years doing hard physical labor. He thought of what he would tell his nephew on the phone that evening, reflecting heavily on the $10 donors, the luxury stay at the Langham, and the vast, undeniable divide separating those two realities. He refrained from clapping or making a sound, but his jaw clenched firmly, the silent reaction when someone finally articulates a burden you've carried for years. If you have ever known someone who preached sacrifice while hiding behind a lavish lifestyle they would never relinquish, type Langham in the comments right now. What you just witnessed was not an isolated slip, but a consistent pattern. And tonight marks the first time someone forced AOC to stand completely accountable inside it. Ocasio-Cortez took a deep breath, gathered her composure, and pivoted to her ultimate defense, the undeniable truth of her personal origin story. You want to know where I came from? She asked, her voice dropping lower, faster, and fiercer than at any point that morning. I entered this work from behind a bar, clearing tables and preparing drinks on my feet for 10-hour stretches while desperately sending money home to keep my family's house. I know what it feels like to struggle to make rent. I know what it means to have your hours severely cut. I learned this nation from the floor up. Senator, not from a privileged memoir about it, but from living on the floor. She leaned forward, her intensity genuine. I have passed legislation that put funds directly into working families' pockets, and I've advocated for those without lobbyists in rooms that aggressively rejected my presence for years. And I have done so while being told constantly by men who look exactly like you and sit precisely where you sit that I am not serious enough, not credentialed enough, or not the right fit for this space. She pointed accusingly at the dais. So do not sit there with your folksy one-liners and your elite Oxford degree that you attempt to hide, telling me I don't understand working people. I have been one. I lived that reality. You merely got to study it through 3 academic degrees. She leaned back forcefully. There is a vast difference between surviving a struggle and auditing it, Senator, and that difference explains the entire story of you. Her point landed beautifully. Her passion was real, her frustration earned, and the entire room moved with her momentum. The reporter wrote furiously. The young woman in the gallery looked back up as the emotional tide swung once more in Ocasio-Cortez's favor. She had successfully utilized the most compelling asset she had left. Kennedy waited patiently for the room to quiet completely. He waited until every trace of energy dissipated, then calmly glanced down at his legal pad at the single word he had written hours earlier and heavily underlined. The warm, folksy demeanor and patient Louisiana grin vanished entirely from his face. What remained beneath was sharp, icy clarity. Nobody up here is disputing your personal journey, Congresswoman, Kennedy said. You came up behind a bar and built something real. That is a genuinely hard thing to do, and I respect it. He paused for one beat. But here is the fundamental problem with everything you just articulated. His voice did not climb. It went the opposite direction, quieter and slower, setting each word down like a heavy stone. You arrogantly entered this room this morning and labeled me a comedian who produces nothing but punchlines. You declared that this country has run out of time for jokes and demands absolute seriousness. All right, let us apply that exact standard to everyone here, you and me both. He referred back to his pad. In February, on a world stage with every camera in Europe pointed directly at you, you placed Venezuela in the wrong half of the planet. You stalled awkwardly for 20 seconds on the most important question in American foreign policy. Members of your own political party noted it on the record. Mark Halperin described it as one of the bigger mistakes you've ever made. And the Washington Post editorial board noted you appeared entirely out of your depth. He paused. And when all of that came back to haunt you, when your own people said it, you went on a live stream and claimed the real problem was that the country had grown accustomed to a president who speaks without thinking. You got asked the hard question, couldn't answer it, and your explanation was that we were simply wrong to expect one. Kennedy shook his head slowly. Now, you just claimed I audit the working class from a comfortable distance instead of living it. Maybe so, I will sit with that. He looked at her with unwavering focus. But I will tell you what I know for absolute certain from where I sit. He let total silence fall over the room. Then, in that same flat Louisiana drawl, Kennedy delivered the knockout blow. My daddy used to say that some people have a billy goat brain and a mockingbird mouth, all the noise in the world. Not a single bite of feed. The gallery broke into overwhelming laughter, not polite chuckles, but an uncontrollable, involuntary wave that swept through the entire space before people could check themselves. A man near the exit pressed his forearm to his face, shaking. A woman near Raymond buried her face in both hands. The roaring sound echoed for 5 full seconds before finally subsiding. In the highly dangerous silence that followed the laugh, every camera lens focused squarely on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She stared down at her legal pad, her detailed notes, and the carefully structured arguments she had loaded and brought into this room that morning. She was a prominent leader who had never once stood before a microphone without a response ready, someone who built her reputation on the certainty that words would always come when called upon. She looked at her notes, looked up, looked back down, and the next sentence simply did not come. The chairman cleared his throat gently, opening a door for her. Congresswoman, do you wish to respond? In the third row, Raymond Thibodeau watched her closely. He recognized that expression, the exact look of someone who has completely run out of words. He had worked alongside loud men who were very loud until the precise moment reality set in. Ocasio-Cortez slowly closed her folder, aligned its edges, and laid her pen on top. The pen made a crisp tap against the wood. She did not touch it again. "I think," she whispered, "the senator has made his priorities clear." She folded her empty hands in her lap. At the end of the dais, John Kennedy reached over and drew a thick line through the single word on his legal pad. He no longer needed it. Raymond Thibodeau stepped out into the late morning sun, blinking. Facing a long drive back to Sulphur with an empty thermos, he reflected on the $10 contributors, the Langham, the 20 seconds of hesitation on Taiwan, and the room full of European diplomats watching an American official struggle on camera. He thought of his nephew back home, and the man at the dais who wrote a single word on a legal pad only to cross it out. Somewhere past the Virginia state line, Raymond began laughing quietly to himself in his truck. It wasn't just the punchline. It was the overall patience and the deliberate speed of the man from Zachary who knew exactly what was coming. Billy Goatbrain and a mockingbird mouth. He drove home in great spirits to a region some had dismissed as simple. John Kennedy quietly departed without waiting for praise, slipping his 3 index cards back into his suit pocket. He walked past the shouting reporters with the steady pace of a man who had gone to the store and retrieved exactly what he came for. If this story resonated with you, type Zachary in the comments. Share this story with someone who appreciates quiet patience over meaningless noise. Your hard work is not a punchline, and the man who waited silently while being mocked knew precisely when to speak. No amount of noise was ever going to rush him. Billy Goatbrain and a mockingbird mouth. All the noise in the world. Not a single bite of feed.